Stefano Domenicali, F1 CEO, has ruffled a few feathers this week. He's dropped some quotes that have wound up a big chunk of the F1 fan base. He's suggesting some pretty significant changes to the sport, and a lot of people are not very happy about it. So, should we be outraged, or is this just another example of the internet making a mountain out of a molehill? Well, my name's Tommo. Let's talk about it. Right, look, we're not going to react to the cherry-picked headlines here. This is going to be a very fast and loose video. We're just going to get straight into the comments, every single word that came out of his mouth, because you can't get the full context without getting into the weeds, all right? The world of social media seems to have lost all understanding of what the word nuance actually means, so I'm going to give him a fair crack. So speaking to journalists around the future of Formula One ahead of this weekend's Italian Grand Prix, let's start with, there's a topic on the table concerning the format we'll use in the coming years, starting with sprint weekends. We need to understand whether to increase them, how to increase them, and whether to use different formats. We have several discussions to have with the teams to decide the direction. So since their introduction in 2021, we have had 21 sprint races in total. One format change as well, the original Sprint Saturday idea dropped for now FP, SQ, SRQ and then R. The format we now have, and reopening Parc Fermé after the sprint race as well. A better format, an improvement, but I still think there's stuff to do. I still think it can be better than it is. No mandatory pit stops, so you don't get tyre offsets, and that is part of why the races are typically pretty dull. Also, fans at home who often work on Fridays are now missing out on competitive action because all of the competitive action used to be just on the weekend. But of course there are pros. I think as a fan, I went to Austria in 2023 for the sprint. I think you get great value for money with your ticket on a sprint weekend versus a typical one. And if that works for the fans on the ground, it also works for the promoters on the ground as well, the people who operate and run these circuits. And look, the drivers do seem to try it as well. I think there was a lot of concern before we got sprint weekends that the drivers wouldn't really be asked, wouldn't really be that bothered, but we still get great wheel-to-wheel racing sometimes. And actually, when I went Austria 23, we had a wet sprint race but then a dry feature race, which was actually kind of cool, seeing the same track on the same weekend in two very, very different weather conditions. That was interesting. Austria for me is a prime sprint venue. They're not all built for it though. Spa this year was not it. I have to say that aside from some old die-hard fans, everyone wants sprint weekends. Promoters push for this format, and now the drivers are interested as well. I'm being a bit provocative. You are, Stefano. Everyone wants sprint weekends apart from the old nerds, apparently. Why is he being provocative here? Because he wants to create a reaction. Why else would he? He knows this is going to get clipped up, he knows this is going to get journaled, he knows this is going to spread onto social media, and he knows this is going to create a reaction. And like I said, from my personal experience, I think it's more value to the fan on the ground, and therefore the promoter is obviously going to be pushing for them. But Stefano is definitely poking the bear to generate headlines, in my opinion. Oh, and as for the drivers being interested as well, we'll get onto that in a bit. Free practice appeals to super specialists, people who want to see more action, prefer a sprint weekend. There's more to discuss and comment on from Friday. There's a qualifying session, but I understand it has to become part of F1 culture. I mean, look, nothing he said here is fundamentally wrong, right? Of course, entertainment is important. Of course it is, but also sporting integrity, culture, tradition, purity, whatever you want to call it. Balance is key here, because you could definitely argue that the build-up of a weekend, having practice sessions, having qualifying, and each session being more exciting than the one before it, that crescendo is arguably better than just having excitement throughout the entire weekend, right? The direction is clear. I can guarantee that in a few years there will be demand to have all weekends with the same format. From the promoters, absolutely yes. From the fan base, I'm not so sure. I'm not saying we'll get MotoGP, which has a sprint at every round. That's too big a step. I see it more as a maturation process that respects a more traditionalist approach. Now for me, this part here is waffle, because to call a sprint at every round too big a step, I think is absolute breeze. I absolutely think that's the plan. It's 6 sprints now, then it'll be 8, then it'll be 10, then it'll be 12. And once it's half the calendar, I think they will justify, you know what, we're just going to have sprints every single weekend. They're drip feeding us this format to get fans used to it, and then eventually it will be the norm. And to be fair, look, while they are struggling with a format that I still don't think is great, okay, I still think it needs work. I think most people would agree on that, even the biggest sprint lovers out there. I think it would have been a mistake to just go all sprints straight away, because again, the format would have been poor for every single weekend and you would have really annoyed the fans. But let's not get it twisted. I am absolutely certain, come back here in 10 years time, every single race on the F1 calendar will be a sprint. I am absolutely sure of it. I'm absolutely sure that is the plan. So then how do we improve the sprint format? Because again, I'm accepting this as an inevitability. I'm not going to sit here and complain about, oh, too many sprints, blah, blah, blah. How do we make the sprints better? Because I think that's the more practical conversation. I mean, in short, I think they need to be more different. I think sprint quali needs to stand out more. Perhaps one shot, it needs to be a completely different format to normal quali in my eyes. I think the sprint races need probably a pit stop, maybe a mandatory compound just for sprints, or actually, you know what, just use the wet compounds. I mean, they never get used apart from pit stop practice anyway, so you might as well give them a run out. Everyone's super low grip would actually be kind of funny. Obviously that's not going to happen, but I mean, it would be a laugh. It's going to happen, and this is what they want, and let's not try and sugarcoat this or paint this otherwise. As for the drivers, initially 18 were against the sprint and 2 in favour. Today, it's the opposite. We discussed it at the dinner we organised in Austria and everyone spoke in favour. Even Max, with whom I spoke one-on-one, is starting to say it makes sense. So I see evolution from everyone. In the end, drivers are born to race. Now look, as hard as it is for me to imagine Max being remotely positive about sprints, I'm going to take Stefano on his word, because again, he knows this is going to get clipped up and reported, and you know Max is going to call BS if this isn't what he thinks, right? But look, to be honest, it might be a bit of a hot take, but I don't really care that much about what the 20 drivers think about the format and how the race, the Grand Prix, how the weekend should be structured. Their opinion isn't particularly high on my priority list. Their skill set, their speciality is to drive the cars, and I will listen to them when they're feeding back about that, the driving dynamics of the cars, sure, but they are a world away from the experience of the fans, 95% of us, who will never get anywhere near driving an F1 car or any racing car for that matter. We don't come from the privilege they do, and we're not interested in the sport for the same reasons that they are. They are there to race. We are there for a variety of different reasons. I mean, I'm not being funny. Look at Jacques Villeneuve, the man who thought Oscar was in the wrong, to quote a little bit nasty, for his move, apparently, on Lando Norris in Canada when Lando just drove into the back of him. Like, he's a one-time F1 world champion. And I will listen to Jacques when it comes to the dynamics of driving, but his opinion when it comes to anything else is no more valid than any other educated Formula One fan. Because to have that take about what happened in Canada, to me, is absolutely insane. Promoters and fans want action, and now they've started to understand it's possible. Our surveys show the vast majority of the audience wants the drivers to fight for a result. To put it bluntly, they're tired of free practice. That's an objective fact we can't ignore. Okay, so next on the chopping block, practice, apparently. And look, my first question, who's getting these surveys? Because I feel like I was missed off the mailing list for this one. Although I guess I'm probably too old and nerdy for them to be interested in my opinion. I mean, look, genuinely, did any of you fill out some F1 survey that was to do with the future of the sport? Because if so, please let me know what that was or what that looked like in the comments down below. I'll be fascinated to hear. I mean, look, again, no one's denying that a competitive session is more interesting, more exciting than a practice session. Like, of course it is. But does that mean the practice sessions have to have zero value to anyone but the teams that are learning ahead of the weekend? No, I don't think so. And look, I'm not talking about holding on to tradition for tradition's sake, because I think that is wrong. And I think you do always need to look ahead to keep the sport, or anything in life really, relevant and interesting, because things change. And I am absolutely up for changes to practice. I think specifically in terms of the information we receive as the fans, like contextualize these run plans, maybe have certain information, more information, not necessarily everything, but more information public, so we can really understand what we're seeing. Because all too often you just see these times and they're on different compounds and you don't know, fuel weight. We're so in the dark, and I think we could have more information to find it more intriguing. And I think that's through graphics, and I think that's through camera work. Look, with a sprint weekend, you still have one practice session, and then you have 2 qualifyings and 2 races. Like, that is plenty of entertainment for a weekend. And actually just having that one practice session, I think, deals with the practice fatigue that I think we've all gone through sometimes, right? If you watch every single practice session, FP1, 2 and 3, you're not glued to the TV set the entire time. Of course you're not. They're not designed to be consumed in that way. If you have one practice session on a sprint weekend, for me, when I'm watching, I'm taking in a lot more of that because I know it's the only one. We're seeing on many of our channels that highlights do very well. For those of us who grew up with the current format, everything is fine as is, but there's a large segment that only wants to see the key moments. Things are going very well today, but precisely for that reason, we must not rest on our laurels. We need to think about the next step. Current races may be a bit too long for younger audiences. So this is probably the most contentious thing Stefano came out with. People love the highlights, so the races should be shorter so they generate less highlights. Look, I know many fellow creators have run into the brick wall that is FOM, Formula One management. They are strict with their footage when it comes to recording from the track or creating edits online. Stefano's also neglected to include the point that F1's behind a paywall for every single market as far as I'm aware, and if you're going to try and appeal to a broader audience that isn't just the top 10% of society that F1 has in the past, well, there is a bit of a cost of living crisis going on at the minute. People can't afford to watch Formula One and pay the subscription to watch it live. So highlights on YouTube that are free and plastered in ads is the way that people have to go a lot of the time. It's not necessarily just because they only want to watch highlights. Sometimes it is born out of financial necessity. And actually, the whole young people short attention span trope is a bit outdated in my opinion. It's like, oh, people can't afford to buy houses because they get too many Costa coffees. Like, how much did you pay for your house back in 2000 and what was that value of that average house relative to your salary? I mean, look at the success of long form podcasting. Look at how I can waffle on my CHINWAG for an hour and a half and get 30,000 plus views. Like, there is an audience for long form content. There always has been, there always will be. Short form doom scrolling absolutely is a thing, and often shorts are the things that hook people onto the longer form stuff. But all audiences, young and old, are interested in both, and you need to be on both. But how about, instead of making the races shorter, you make the existing races more interesting and exciting, and then they generate even more highlights that you love so much, because yes, highlights are great. Engineer a formula that doesn't create a bunch of dirty air, cars that make a lovely sound, look amazing, are as safe as realistically achievable, nimble, agile, and allows engineering ability but also driver ability to show itself and thrive. Let the weekend come to this crescendo on this Grand Prix Sunday, build up towards it, and then have this box office 90-minute plus showcase. Remember, we've only got 24 events all weekend. That is the entire sport done. I mean, f*** it, if you need to drop the open wheel aesthetic, cover the wheels to create less dirty air and make these cars more drivable, a lot of people would be pissed off about it. But if we got way better wheel-to-wheel racing, people would calm down. Shortening the Grand Prix? That just feels like a weird thing to do. Reverse grids are in our agenda. We've discussed it before, but in the coming months we'll need the courage to push the discussion again, because I've heard several drivers propose it. At first everyone's against it, but at the last meeting many of them said, why don't we try it? Look, I wasn't there in the meeting, I wasn't a fly on the wall. I don't like the way Stefano is trying to picture this and frame it as like, oh, the drivers want this, so I'm just going along with it. I mean, a push for reverse grids is nothing new. It's been a conversation for years now. Fast cars at the back equals more overtaking, which equals more entertainment, right? Look, it works in junior formulas, in F2, F3. It's a spec series that's specifically designed to be the second and final step towards getting to Formula One. So it's a test as much as anything of these drivers. If you've got a driver who's consistently making their way through the pack and succeeding, then an F1 team who's interested in signing them is going to look a lot more favourably on that driver. But from a sporting integrity point of view, it definitely loses points, and that's where it's always going to hit a brick wall amongst a lot of the fan base. I don't think there's a wrong stance here. Every opinion has value. We'll evaluate it within the FIA and interpret an evolving trend as best as possible, that's for sure. Because for me, if they're going to do reverse grids, that is a change that is massive, and they need to get it right straight out the gate. Because mandating a two-stop at Monaco didn't work. And look, I thought for years it was going to work and improve the races, not on its own in isolation, but as part of a broader change. Turns out the teams found a way to game it, and it made a dull race even duller, arguably. I think there's a world it could work, reverse grids, and it could be interesting, but I would rather an F1 where the formula creates something that is very, very tight, so that you don't need the gimmick of reverse grids. But if you're going to preserve the engineering side of F1 and not make it a spec series, I think some gimmicks are probably necessary, just not this one. Because look, let's be honest, F1 has always been mostly about the car. And we are all guilty of rose tint in the past, but we forget that you go, 30, 40 years back and, I mean, half the grid DNF'd and you'd get winning margins of minutes rather than seconds. But that's when the sport was reserved for the upper class in society, the top 1%, to afford to be able to go. It was a rich old men's club, right? That's not what the sport is anymore. At least that's not what it's trying to project and trying to be. It's trying to be more inclusive to any and all, and the sport has to change to accommodate that. Look, for me, my opinion, keep the races the same distance, no reason to change that. Improve the sprints, make the practices more interesting, no reverse grids, but make a formula that makes the cars more raceable, ultimately. And also, I do accept that us hardcore fans do make up a very small portion of the total fan base, but I do believe that in any sport, it is the hardcore fan bases that underpin the core intrigue and interest within that sport. So to overlook the opinions of us and just be like, oh, the diehards, old nerds, they're going to say one thing, but we're going to do another, to ignore us, I think that's a severe mistake. That's my opinion, but what's yours? Let me know in the comments below. My name's Tomo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.